Good morning. Glad to see you here. Got some travelers gone. Some others gone that I didn't know would be gone, but we're in 1 Kings chapter 2 in our study. Moving right along in this study about David and Solomon. Lesson 8, which is basically the transition between David and Solomon. Last week we saw where David chose Solomon to be the next king. Now we see where David's end comes and Solomon begins his reign, or is about to begin his reign. And a transition of any kind is not always the easiest thing that we do. It's whether we're moving places in general, or whether leadership is changing, coaches of a team. Transitions have their own difficulties and complications. Especially when we're talking about a king, there are many questions that might arise, like how will this leader compare to the other that they're replacing? Will they do things relatively the same way? If it's different, how will it be different? How well will this person get along with others? What kind of changes might they make? Well, as the kingship in Israel was about to change, they were probably going to have questions like these. Would Solomon be like David? Would he serve like David? Would he face challenges like David that were greater from within his own family than from without? Would Solomon provide stability in a time of peace, a time of prosperity? Well, that's what David wanted anyway for his son. And he was going to give him some advice that he wanted his son to follow as the next king, as his son and as the king that would replace him. So in this lesson, we're going to see not only that advice, but we'll also see, at least at first, whether or not he followed the advice. David was in a good position to give advice for the next king. Here's what he told his son Solomon, beginning in verse 1 of 1 Kings 2. It said, "When David's time to die drew near, he commanded Solomon his son, saying, I am about to go the way of all the earth. Be strong and show yourself a man, and keep the charge of Jehovah your God, walking in his ways and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his rules, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn, that Jehovah may establish his word that he spoke concerning me, saying, If your sons pay close attention to their way, to walk before me in faithfulness with all their heart and with all their soul, and you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel." That's the first 4 verses, which contains the bulk of what we might apply to ourselves here. Pretty good advice. Be strong or courageous. He says, show yourself a man, show yourself to be a man. In other words, prove yourself to be a man, a real man. And then he gives him the most important advice that anybody could ever get or give. He says, keep the charge of Jehovah your God, walking in his ways, keeping his statutes, commandments, his rules, and his testimonies. It's almost like he didn't want to leave any room, he didn't want to leave anything out. So what exactly are we keeping? Well, we keep the charge, we walk in his ways, we keep his statutes, we keep his commandments, we keep his rules, keep his testimonies. And then, as he quotes God himself, he says that they need to pay close attention to their way. They need to walk before me in faithfulness with all their heart and with all their soul. This kind of seemingly redundant language is pretty common in the Old Testament. Keep his God's commandments, walk in his rules, walk in his statutes, walk in his commandments. Don't turn to the right hand or to the left. And I think there's a reason for that. I mean, it's important. It's extremely important and sensitive of a situation to not turn at all from God's way. Stay on the path. Moses said similar things in Deuteronomy 17, verses 18 through 20, about a king. He said, "And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, approved by the Levitical priests, and it shall be with him, and he shall read in it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear Jehovah his God by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes, and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment, either to the right hand or to the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel." David was aware of those words. David would know those words, Moses' words in Deuteronomy 17. And he wanted to impress this upon Solomon. First of all, trusting in God's promises. He said, this is important that you do this because it will result in God establishing his own word about us, about me, about our house. And then there's that quote again, the big if. If your sons pay close attention to their way to walk before me in faithfulness with all their heart and with all their soul, you will not lack a man on the throne of Israel. As we get into the reign of Solomon, that's a good thing to file in the back of your minds. That big if. If your sons do that. Sadly, we learned that before too long, David's descendants did not follow this advice. But God still held true to his word, because there was a very important king that would come from the line of David that was prophesied, and he would reign forever and ever. He wasn't going to reign in Jerusalem, literally, but he would reign over the new Jerusalem, the heavenly Jerusalem, and is. His name was Jesus, by the way, if that wasn't clear. So after he encouraged Solomon to put God first in everything, he turned to some more practical things. There were certain people in the kingdom at that time that needed to be dealt with as far as David was concerned. One of them was Joab. We know Joab, don't we? That snaky, slithery war leader. He now is going to be, Solomon's going to be advised by David to do something about him. He says that he was guilty of shedding blood, the blood of war, in a time of peace, because he murdered Abner and Amasa. That's verse 5. And you can look at 2 Samuel 3, 26 to 27, 2 Samuel 20, verses 8 through 10 for those accounts. Then he disobeyed David's order to spare Absalom. We studied that one here a few weeks ago. 2 Samuel 18, 5 and 14. He supported Adonijah that we saw a couple weeks ago, or last week even. Adonijah tried to take the throne of David. He supported him. And David knew he couldn't be trusted anymore. So he told Solomon to Act therefore according to your wisdom, but do not let his gray head go down to Sheol in peace. Then he said to deal loyally with the sons of Barzillai the Gileadite, because of the help that he showed, or gave him. And then he said, he brought up Shimei again. The man that he had pardoned earlier. Now David tells Solomon that he needed to be dealt the king's justice after all. Whatever we might say about that, David at least seemed to think that that was something that needed to be done from the king. Shimei the Benjaminite, the one who came out and cursed David and then apologized later, and David did forgive him. Now he says that's got to stop. So, next couple three verses record the transition. And here's a very important Old Testament phrase. David slept with his fathers. But what makes this phrase even more important is the next one. And was buried. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because there are some who claim that the euphemism or idiom slept with his fathers means that he was buried in the place of his fathers. They say that means that they took his body and they put him to rest in the place where his fathers are. Like similar to being buried in a cemetery next to maybe your loved ones, or you have a special area in general where your family is going to be buried. But that doesn't work here, does it? Because it says that he slept with his fathers and was buried separately. Those are two separate things. And in my opinion, they're in order, chronological order. Slept with his fathers, in other words, means that he died and went to another place. And then meanwhile, back on earth, his body was buried. So he went and slept with his fathers, and his body was buried. And we see this so many times in the Old Testament. I've got a whole list of scriptures where this kind of thing, this same language is used. Chapter 11, verse 43, chapter 14, verse 31, chapter 15, chapter 16, 2 Kings 8, 2 Kings 10, 2 Kings 13, 2 Kings 14, 15, 16, 21. So many times a person is said to have slept with their fathers and was buried. And not every single time is it said in that exact way, but in all of these instances and several more that I didn't mention, so-and-so slept with his fathers and he was buried. It says it about Moses too. And yet, nobody even knows where Moses was buried. So he obviously, one thing we do know is Moses was not buried anywhere where any people of his were buried before him. So, and yet it says Moses slept with his fathers. So obviously, the Old Testament expression to sleep with your fathers doesn't have anything to do with the place where you're buried. So what does it mean? Well, it seems that the people, the men, the writers of the Old Testament believed that when a person dies, they're not really gone. They're gone from the earth, but they're still somewhere. They're with their people, the people who went before them, either for good or evil. They go to them, with them, in the next place or the afterlife, the next phase of the afterlife anyway. So, just wanted to point that out in 1 Kings 2:10. So David slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. And the time that David reigned over Israel was 40 years. He reigned 7 in Hebron and 33 in Jerusalem. So Solomon sat on the throne of David his father, and his kingdom was firmly established. God made it so. Smooth transition. Now Solomon is the one who God intended to be the king. In the same way, maybe not in the exact same way that it worked out, but at least Solomon had God's blessing to be the next king. So his throne, his kingdom was firmly established. Well, now Adonijah pops back up. Now, this is just my opinion. If you're somebody like Adonijah who has done what Adonijah has done and who's been forgiven and spared, then the advice that I would give Adonijah is, Adonijah, you need to go somewhere and keep your little mouth shut. That's what I would say. Period. Forever. Until you die. Until you sleep with your fathers, you just go away somewhere and just zip it up. But Adonijah wasn't going to do that. So he apparently was, we know he's bold because of what he already tried to do, which, if you don't remember, was he did what Absalom did, started a whole rebellion to try to usurp the throne from David. And he lost. There wasn't a battle in this instance, but he was outwitted, and then Solomon chose to spare him. Now, an unspecified amount of time has passed. It doesn't give the impression that very much time has passed. But Solomon's officially the king, and this is what we read. Then Adonijah, the son of Haggith, came to Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon. And she said, "Do you come peacefully?" He said, "Peacefully." "Yep, I do." Then he said, "I have something to say to you." She said, "Speak." He said, "You know that the kingdom was mine, and that all Israel fully expected me to reign. However, the kingdom has turned about and become my brother's, for it was his from Jehovah." Notice that. There it is again. Adonijah seemed to understand that the kingdom is Solomon's from Jehovah. All the more reason to just keep your mouth shut and just get over it somewhere quietly. Anyway, "And now I have one request to make of you. Do not refuse me. I just want one thing." So she said, "Okay, what is it?" And he said, please ask King Solomon, he won't refuse you, to give me Abishag the Shunammite as my wife." Now, I don't know about you, but on the surface, that means absolutely nothing to me.
Yeah, because I was like, why would he have to ask his brother for permission for this woman as wife, unless she was already married to Solomon or something? Otherwise,
Well, it's even more complicated than that. It has a lot to do with culture, has a lot to do with culture, basically. Abishag was, like I said, it's extremely complicated to our minds, but she was essentially considered among the women that were labeled as concubines. She fell into the category of concubine to David. Now, she was not his concubine, which is a fancy word. The closest thing in our culture would be a girlfriend, basically. Just, a side piece. She wasn't his concubine in the normal sense. She was the one who was looking after David in his last days. She was taking care of David on his deathbed. But because of her role and position, she technically was considered to be one of the king's concubines, which I guess now would mean she's technically, that would fall into Solomon's category. But the point is, what this request implied, not the request per se, but if it was done, what it would imply is basically it would be tantamount to him trying to pull another rebellion again. Him trying to pull, remember what we said the significance was of Solomon riding on David's mule? And people would see that and be like, oh, he's on the king's own mule. That means he is in line next. He's the king. Well, same principle. He takes one of the king's concubines. It's basically to be interpreted as whoever does that is claiming the king's place, rights. Why would he do this? I have no idea. Maybe he just was so full of himself he thought he could get away with this. Maybe it was just to be a slap in the face to Solomon. I don't know. I can't read minds. I can't even read minds now. I can't read somebody's mind 3,000 years ago for sure. All I know is that for some reason, this was the one request, and I can't help but think he was up to something. It's not like he just innocently fell in love with Abishag the Shunammite and was like, please, I want to have her as my wife. She loves me, I love her, it's meant to be. No, he's up to something. Well, Bathsheba says, all right, I'll speak to the king. So she does. Verse 19 says she went to King Solomon to speak to him on behalf of Adonijah. She said, she just relayed everything. She said, I have one small request to make of you. Don't refuse me. The king said to her, make your request, my mother, for I will not refuse you. You see, she's actually doing Adonijah a pretty decent favor because she's not just relaying to him what Adonijah asked. She's asking him as if it's her request. If you notice that in the language. I have one small request to make of you. And she said, let Abishag the Shunammite be given to Adonijah, your brother. She didn't even mention that Adonijah asked me to do this. And that was the whole point. That was what the favor he was asking, because he said, he won't refuse you. So you go ask him from you. And that's what she does. But Solomon knew something was up. As shocking as a request as it was, it's even more shocking coming from his own mother. So that's how he responded. He said, why you ask that? Why are you asking Abishag the Shunammite for Adonijah? Something's going on. Why don't you go ahead and ask the kingdom also for him? Is that tomorrow? Tomorrow you're going to come in and ask for the whole kingdom? After all, he is my older brother. And he's got Abiathar on his side, the priest. He's got Joab, the son of Zeruiah, on his side. Well, he knew what this was about. So he said, actually the text says, King Solomon swore by Jehovah, saying, God do so to me and more also, if this word does not cost Adonijah his life. Now therefore, as Jehovah lives, who has established me and placed me on the throne of David my father, and who has made me a house as he promised, Adonijah shall be put to death today. So King Solomon sent Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, and he struck him down and he died. Just like that. Notice he didn't kill his mother. He knew that this was all Adonijah's plot. If nothing else, we see Solomon so far not making the same mistake that his father had made on on multiple occasions where he didn't do anything. And look how many problems. He already caused problems in the sense enough that God said, the sword shall never depart from your house. But David's subsequent mistakes added even more trouble to his house, especially his negligence in dispensing justice. Amnon, what Solomon did here, David should have done with Amnon. Not just pronouncing the death penalty, but he did it that day. I'm telling you, there is wisdom in that as a government policy. If there were people who, I'm not talking about a crime like this one, because again, this is a cultural thing we might struggle to comprehend exactly. But if somebody commits a crime that is worthy of death, if they would be put to death that day, there'd be a lot less crime. There's no doubt about that. It's a huge deterrent, and it is justice that God has granted government powers to hold. That's what Paul said anyway. God's given them the sword, and they don't bear it in vain. God has given them the authority to bear the sword, to wield the sword, and to use the sword. And even Paul himself said, if I've done something worthy of death, I don't want to live. I don't want to be spared. If I've actually done something worthy of death, by all means, I request and demand to be put to death, because that's the right thing. And God said that many times in many different ways in the Old Testament. Yes, sir?
I guess Benaniah, he would have been the king's executioner. That's what his job was, I guess.
It's what it sounds like.
Yeah.
Or else he, maybe not officially, but he must have been the right man for the job. Either way, he did it. And again, Solomon's swift, it wasn't that this was an emotionally charged response. It may seem that way based on the way he reacted, but it's also justified. He did this because this is unacceptable, and this is worthy of death. And if we think that that's a little bit harsh to be worthy of death, don't forget that God himself said, if children are disobedient to their parents, they ought to be put to death.
This commentary says that in their culture, taking possession of the harem or concubine of a deceased king is equivalent to an establishment of the claim to the throne.
Yeah. So for him to do this, and he sort of told on himself, not as far as Solomon was concerned, but as far as the reader's concerned, when he prefaced the whole thing with these remarks like, I ought to be the king. He said, everybody wanted me to be king. The kingdom was mine. And then he implies that it should be now. And then the request that he made is basically, I'm going to make another claim to the throne. And Solomon says, no, he's not. He'll never make another claim to the throne again. And I'll guarantee it, because he's going to be dead. And he did put him to death, just like that. So again, David's pain would have been much less if he had acted as decisively as Solomon did here with Amnon. And, that would have kept Absalom from going down the spiral he went down. And he at least felt that he should have dispensed justice on Shimei. He obviously should have done something about Joab, because now on his deathbed, he's telling Solomon, you got to do what I failed to do. You got to take care of Joab. He's out of control. Can't trust him. Shimei should be punished. And now he's learning from that advice and dispensing justice swiftly in the case of Adonijah. Has nothing to do with a person going on a personal vendetta, vengeance for something that a wrong they've been done. The Bible speaks to that too. Paul's the same man who said the government bears the sword on God's behalf. God's given them that authority. He said, you do not repay evil with evil. You leave it to God, who then left it also to civil authorities. God says there is a time when it is not right for a person to die, or he says there is a time when those that should live die, and he says there's also a time when those who do not deserve to live do live. God thinks there is such a thing as a person who deserves to die. So that should be enough for any Christian to conclude that the wisdom in capital punishment. If there is sufficient warning, then there's no such thing as a crime that's a punishment that's too harsh for the crime as far as I'm concerned, if there is sufficient warning. Number 1, applications. We already pointed it out. No better advice that anybody could ever give or receive than to just do what God says. Live your life according to God's instructions in every way. That's what David told Solomon. It's also what Solomon told his sons. In Proverbs 3, verses 5 through 7, trust in Jehovah with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make straight your paths. Be not wise in your own eyes. Fear Jehovah and turn away from evil. How do you acknowledge God in all your ways? What does that mean, do you think?
Word and deed, I guess.
Okay, in word and deed. Usually we would think acknowledging is something that you do first mentally, and then sometimes acknowledging something is verbally, like, yes, I acknowledge that this thing is true. But how do you acknowledge God in all your ways?
Like considered in everything you do.
Okay. Yeah. Everything you do. All your ways. Acknowledge God. So, an acknowledgement of God, and not just His existence, but what He is, who He is, and what He desires, should be evident in everything we do. It's a tall order, but it's right. It's the right thing. In everything that we do, the thing that we do should reflect our belief and relationship to God. And one of those things, specifically mentioned in that verse, is to turn away from evil in all its forms. Turn away from evil. Fear Jehovah, turn away from evil. Don't be wise in your own eyes. Turn away from evil. And then, like we just talked about, Solomon didn't hesitate to dispense justice, and that was going to be a crucial part of a smooth and successful reign. Sadly, as we're going to see as we get in further into Solomon's reign, he didn't always listen to this advice. He had a strong start, really did. You know who else had a strong start? Saul. The first king started, he looked the part. That's what we're told first. Taller than everybody. He just had some regal, kingly appearance. Started so strong. Put people in awe. Like, wow. This is everything a king ought to be. And then he just went way down the deep end. Way down the rabbit hole. Well, he is remembered for that. Solomon, it seems to me, has generally gotten away with that more than Saul has. He's remembered for some reason as being almost as if he didn't ever experience any downfall spiritually. Yes, his kingdom was at peace. Not really any thanks to him. That's thanks to God. His kingdom was prosperous. Again, not necessarily thanks to Solomon necessarily, but it was thanks to God. God blessed the kingdom. But there were also some times later that he really messed up. You know, one of the reasons why the nation was so prosperous in one sense was because the king had put so much burden on the people. And they grew very, very tired of Solomon by the end. If you remember, after he died, and Jeroboam or Rehoboam was going to take his place, they said, "Your father put way too big of a burden on us. Please lighten the load. Please lessen the burden that your father put on us." And he made the tragic mistake of saying, "No, I'm going to increase it even more. That'll really show them that I mean business." And the kingdom was totally torn in two. So, you know, the implication of that is, it's not an implication, it just proves it. The people were very burdened under Solomon's reign, at least near in the second half of it. Yes, sir.
When we talk about that, it sounds like Solomon just basically gave the people freedom to do what they want.
In a lot of ways, they had a lot more freedom in one way because they didn't have war. There were no wars going on during Solomon's reign. Under David's reign, they did have some, and especially turmoil within the kingdom. So that there was a little bit more, there was peace. It was a time of peace, and that always means more freedom.
What do you mean by burden, though? Like working them hard?
Taxes,
Oh, okay.
forced labor. You know, we talk about the Temple of Solomon, how beautiful it was. And later, whenever they tried to rebuild it after the captivity, there were men, the older men were, weeping. There was people weeping for joy, but there were men that were weeping out of despair because it was nothing like Solomon's temple. Well, you know why Solomon's temple was so beautiful in part? Was because of how much forced labor he put on the Israelites. That was not done before. The forced labor was assigned to the non-Israelite people. But Solomon forced the Israelites. And that was another part of the burden. So, yes, there was this glory and splendor in Solomon's reign, and Jesus used him as an example of splendor in that way because that's what he was known for by the Jews. But we also have to remember, yes, God gave him wisdom. He was explicitly said to be the wisest man on the face of the earth. But the wisdom that he asked for was wisdom to govern well. And he showed that. Now sometimes governing well, cleverly, isn't always going to result in the right thing to do. Heavy taxes and stuff, that's a pretty clever way to run a government, isn't it? Well, it depends on if you're the one in charge. Sounds like a great idea. All these people under me got money. I'll make them give me some money. I'll make them give us money, the government money. So yeah, the incomes were through the roof. But at whose expense? The people's expense, in a large part. So Solomon had the wisdom that God gave him, but that doesn't mean that he always used it properly. He did at first. But his big downfall was whenever he married all these women from other religions. They were from other countries. But the problem wasn't that they were from other countries. It was because those countries worship false gods. And everything that his father had taught him, everything that God had taught him, started to go away, fade away from his mind, because he put those things first. He put his politics first.
And we're influenced by the people that we affiliate ourselves with. I mean, like
Yeah.
Solomon, who's spending time with them, he's obviously being influenced.
He stopped doing what David had told him to do here. You acknowledge or you follow Jehovah. How did he put it? You keep the charge of Jehovah your God, walking in his ways, keeping his statutes, his commandments, his rules, his testimonies, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn. What he started to do was compromise. He had all these wives with all these false gods, so hey, I could probably gain even more power if I just start to dabble in this stuff a little bit. I'll start worshiping, I'll start honoring some of these gods. Because all of his marriages, Solomon wasn't just a huge womanizer. Every one of those marriages meant something. But, they all meant one thing. But each one of them meant it. Why, especially back in the old days, what kind of people did royal persons marry? Other royal persons. From other families or other nations even. Because then they are bound. Well, you do that 700 times. That's power. Unthinkable power. But with that, Solomon's morals down, 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 down. Because he let that outweigh God's will in his heart. So he started strong, and his father gave him the best advice he could give him. But once his father dies, he can't do it anymore. He can't give him that advice anymore. So at this point, we're sort of hanging in the balance of how is Solomon going to respond. Will he keep it? Will he follow David's instruction? Well, so far he's doing okay. Dispensing justice, doing what's right, understanding that God gave him this kingdom and has fulfilled his promise in him. But it's up to him to keep following it.